Hey, what's up guys? So today I'm going to be talking about implementing authentication from scratch, in particular using the Next.js framework. So in general, there's a bunch of approaches to authentication, especially for Next.js. And many of these I'm sure you've already heard of, like Supabase, Next Auth, etc. But for this video, I want to take a look at Lucia Auth, which was a package released a few years ago for implementing authentications with sessions. It's been deprecated now, but the docs are still up, and it serves as a really great learning opportunity for implementing auth from scratch. So that's what I'm going to be taking a look at today. Okay, so let's take a deeper look at some authentication options that you might have presented to you if you're making a web application. So I would say there's a few different approaches for authentication, and at the highest level, we have what is authentication as a service. And this includes platforms such as Clerk, Okta, Firebase, also Supabase, which I didn't put on here. But these are entire platforms that provide everything you need for auth and offer a lot of features right out of the box. So for example, there's pre-built auth components, a lot of different authentication flows that are already created for you, and a nice dashboard for the user management. And all of these are great solutions, and you'll see them a lot in different YouTube tutorials. And they provide a lot of complex features for auth right out the box, which is very convenient. But some of these platforms are also kind of brittle, and I've seen a lot of people complain about, hard to understand error messages and a lack of documentation for them. And then on top of that, these platforms can also get pretty expensive if you have a lot of users. And if you find down the line that these services don't offer quite what you want, it can be quite difficult to export your users and migrate to a new auth solution. And that's probably the biggest philosophical issue I have with them, is that you're using a third party to take ownership over the most sensitive and important part of your application, which is the user information. So there's definitely pros and cons to using these different solutions. And that's why there's another step down, which is self-hosted identity providers. And these offer, a lot of user management like the previous solutions, but you host these yourself. So that means you can spin up an EC2 on Amazon or Droplet on DigitalOcean or whatever, and that will function as your authentication server. So all of your users will be authenticated using that backend, but you're also able to have full control over your users, and you can take those users and migrate them to another platform if you need, or do whatever you want with them. That includes Ori, and Keycloak is also a very popular solution that has a really long history as well. And then lastly, these solutions here are what I would generally call local auth. And that means authentication is handled entirely on your server. And so all of these are just different TypeScript packages that you install on your server, and they offer different functions for authenticating users and ways to tie into different databases and OAuth providers. Now, if you have a large application or looking for a solution you can just plug into your app in 2 minutes, platforms like Clerk are going to make that very, very easy and extremely convenient if you need to just put something together really quickly. But for a lot of small apps, I don't think it's quite necessary to use something like Clerk. And, the less code is better, I would say. And it's also a lot, down the line, it might be a lot better to have complete ownership over your users and also an ability to fully understand your code base and everything that's going on here. And even just aside from that, I think it's really great for learning purposes because, if you're a web developer and you always rely on Clerk or Okta or Firebase, you're not going to necessarily even know basic things like how sessions are implemented or how to do things from scratch. So that's why I'm going to focus on these today. And in particular, I'm going to look at Lucia as a learning experience. Before I get into all that though, I would definitely recommend this video, The State of Authentication, if you are interested in all the different authentication solutions out there. This guy, Theo, T3.gg, has a really great comparison of all these in really extreme detail. So if that is something that interests you and you want to find like the absolute best auth solution for what you're trying to do, I would recommend taking a look at this video. Okay, right now I'm on the website for Lucia Auth. And we can see here that the top line is Lucia is now a learning resource for implementing auth from scratch. See the announcement for details and the migration path. And if I go to this announcement, on GitHub, we can see a message from Pilcrow, the creator of the package. And essentially, he decided to archive the project because implementing sessions is fairly straightforward, But adding in all the adapters for the databases is a bunch of extra work. And at the end of the day, it's sort of unneeded because whoever's using this package is probably going to be able to make their own solutions for the database adapters. And it's not necessarily worth it to, offer all that code when, the person using the logic will just be able to implement it themselves. So to keep everything more lean, they deprecated the package and turned it into a guide for implementing sessions from scratch. And that's what we're looking at here when we go back to the page. This is the old website for Lucia Auth, and if we go to the overview and the basic API, we can actually see this gives us all the details for how to do authentication from scratch using sessions. Okay, so at a high level, how does Lucia work? Well, Lucia is session authentication from scratch using cookies. And as a reminder, I'm going to take a look at this graphic, and this provides a pretty good overview of what's going on with sessions and cookies. At the top here, a user logs in and the backend creates a session for that particular user. That session has an ID, which is then stored in the cookie, and then that's set on the user's browser. That means when the user goes to another page on the website, this session ID is sent in the cookie to the backend, and the backend verifies this session ID and uses it to retrieve the session from the session store. And that session stored here has the user ID. And then once we have the user ID, we can use that to, retrieve who the user actually is and give them all the confidential information that they need. And if we go back to Lucia's documentation, I'm on this basic API page right here, and I'm going to be looking at the API that they recommend for SQLite. And if we scroll down to this section, which is create your API, this has all the functions that we need in order to implement a basic version of this flow. So we can see it's actually pretty simple, and we'll get into how to actually implement all these and how they work together in order to implement sessions. And if we scroll down, we can see that this is the full code that represents those stepped out functions on top. And this is pretty straightforward actually, but I think there are a couple of points that can be made about some of these things that are being done in these functions, so I think it's best to go over it. And at the top here, we have this generate session token function. And if we go back to our graphic, we remember that this session ID is stored in our cookie, and we take that session ID and use it to verify and retrieve the session. So this is what's going to be stored on the user's browser in their cookie every time they make a request. And in order to get that ID, we just make a array of bytes, and we populate that byte array with random values. And important point, I think he mentions it up here somewhere, if I can find it. We do not want to use math.random for generating these values because that's not actually going to give us very random values. It's better to use the crypto package. And the reason why it's so important these values are random is because imagine there was some way for a hacker to guess the ID of a user session. That would be pretty bad because it means that they can just put that on their cookie and they could use that to log in as any user. So obviously we want to make this as hard to guess as possible. That's why the values need to be as close to random as they can be. And then after that, we just encode the token, and that's to make it a bit easier for humans to read. And an important note here also is we can see we're using this package encode base 32 lowercase no padding, and that's taken from this other package called Oslo/encoding. And this is a companion package, I guess. It has a bunch of utility functions that we can use to help encode things, or there's another one from the Oslo/crypto, which is for hashing. So that's another package you will have to download if you want to use it exactly as they're doing here. But beyond that, there's no other real dependencies. It's just the Oslo package and then the code that's shown here for implementing really simple sessions. And then right below that function, we can see there's the one for creating the session. And this takes in the token from above, and it also takes in a user ID. And this is going to be creating the session and storing it in our session store. And what it does is it takes this token generated from here, and it actually ends up hashing it. That's what this is doing. And it's hashing it because imagine if we were to store all these tokens as they were in our session store. That means, if we somehow leaked access to our database a hacker got access to our database and they could see all these session IDs, they could easily log in as other users. So instead we hash it so that they get the hashed values and they can't really do anything with that, right? And then after that, we actually create the session here, we set an expiration date, and right below, we just put that into the database. And we have the session ID set here, the user ID, and the expiration date as well. And that's pretty straightforward, I think. And now we have kind of a longer function involved, which is the validate session token. If we go back here, that's what is going on in this part of the graphic. Every single time that the user makes a request to the backend, it's sending the request and a cookie. And we're taking that, once again, session ID from the cookie, and we're using it to verify the session. So what does that mean, like the validate or verify the session token? So what we're doing in this function, we get the token from the cookie, we hash it, because once again, we hash the token when we're actually making the session with it. And then after that, we try to find any row in our database in the sessions table that corresponds with this session ID. If we can't find one in our database, well, that means that there's no session that relates to that signed in user. So we just return session null and user null as well. On the other hand, we might actually get back a session. So we fill in a session object here and we fill in a user object based on the row that's returned. And then we have some logic here which determines whether the session has expired or not. And if the session has expired, well, we want the user to log in again. So that's what happens here is we're deleting the expired session, and then we also return session null and user null, and that lets whatever's calling this function know that there's no valid session. And then lastly, there's an interesting piece of code here. Basically what this does is it sees if the expiration date is coming up soon. And if that is the case, we don't want to force the user to log in again because it shows their account is pretty active. We don't want to force them to log in if they've been using the account a lot. And all we do in that case is we extend the session. We can see we actually update the session and we update the expires at field to a new expires at time so we can let the user keep using their account without having to log in again. So really that's it. And then there's a couple more functions here in validate sessions. We can see that this deletes all sessions of a specific session ID. Imagine you need to manually log out a user for some reason. And then if invalidate all sessions takes in a user ID, and this is used to, delete all user sessions that's related to a specific user. So once again, these could be for either logging out, like if a user wants to delete a session that effectively logs them out from our application, or it could be used if you're an admin and someone steals a user's token and is using that to log in as them, you might want to delete the session for that reason. So that's pretty much it, right? It's a fairly straightforward API, but this is what allows us to fully implement this flow right here. And if we scroll down a bit further to the very bottom, it says using your API, and when a user signs in, generate a session token with generate session token, create a session linked to it with create session. So this just gives us a really short example of how to use those two functions. Like we get the token using generate session token, and we create the session using create session with that token and the user ID. This creates a session in our database while this sets it on the cookie. And then an example of validating a user provided token. All we do is we get the token from the cookie, and if the token is not null, then we get the session in the user from that validate session token. So really this is all pretty straightforward, but I think it's still a really good exercise to go over these functions to just see how they work and assure ourselves that this is what we want to do in order to implement sessions and authentication. So that's pretty much it. In the next video, I'm going to go over a pretty simple sample application that I made using Next.js and some of these implemented APIs and show you how to implement sessions from scratch in a pretty simple mock example.